So imagine a microscopic world, right? Like inside you right now, where one tiny change can make a huge difference. We're talking about a single alteration in a protein leading to like a lifetime of health issues.
Mhm.
That's what we're diving deep into today.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. You sent us some really interesting stuff about sickle cell disease. It's a group of inherited blood disorders.
Right.
And we're going to unpack it all, like what it is, how it was discovered, why that sickle shape of the red blood cells, has such a big impact.
Yeah.
The core problem, like we'll see, comes down to a genetic mutation. This tiny little flaw in like our instruction manual leads to an abnormal version of hemoglobin,
Right.
which is, the thing that carries oxygen in our blood.
Exactly.
And under certain conditions, this causes the red blood cells to twist into a sickle shape instead of being, round and flexible. And that has like major consequences.
Absolutely.
Big time.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that sickle cell disease, or SCD, it's not just one thing. It's a bunch of different inherited blood disorders.
Oh.
Yeah. And the most common and often the most severe is sickle cell anemia.
Right.
Like you said, the root of the problem is a defect in hemoglobin.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, adults have hemoglobin A or HbA. But in SCD, there's this faulty gene that makes an altered form, hemoglobin S or HbS.
Okay, so the type of SCD someone has depends on like what genes they get from their parents.
Exactly. So like if someone gets two HbS genes, one from each parent, that's HbSS, which is classic sickle cell anemia.
Gotcha.
Then there's HbSC, where someone gets an HbS gene from one parent and a gene for a different abnormal hemoglobin HbC from the other.
Interesting.
That usually has milder symptoms than HbSS.
Okay.
And then there's HbS beta thalassemia.
Right.
That's where an HbS gene is paired with a gene for beta thalassemia, which affects, the production of Beta-Globin, which is a part of hemoglobin.
Right.
And the severity of that one can really vary.
Okay.
And then there are even rarer forms like HbSD, HbSE, and HbSO. Each of those has one HbS gene and a gene for another, less common hemoglobin variant.
Wow, so many different variations.
Yeah, it's complicated.
Now, what about sickle cell trait? I've heard that term before. How does that fit in?
That's a really important distinction. Sickle cell trait, or SCT, or HbAS, is when someone gets one normal hemoglobin gene, HbA, and one sickle hemoglobin gene, HbS.
Mm-hmm.
People with SCT usually don't have any symptoms of SCD and live perfectly normal, healthy lives.
Really?
Yeah, but they're carriers of the sickle cell gene.
Okay.
So they could pass it on to their kids if their partner is also a carrier.
Right.
It's worth noting that in some really rare and extreme conditions, like if someone's really dehydrated or doing really intense exercise at high altitude, even people with SCT can have problems.
Wow, even then.
Yeah, and in very, very rare cases, it's even been linked to sudden death.
So even the trait can be serious in certain situations.
Yeah, but it's very uncommon.
Okay, so the main thing with SCD itself is that the red blood cells actually change shape, right?
Exactly. They go from being round and flexible to hard, sticky, and shaped like a sickle or a half moon. This happens mainly when there's not enough oxygen in the blood.
Okay.
And these sickle-shaped cells cause all sorts of problems, like anemia, where there are fewer red blood cells than normal, and those really painful sickle cell crises, and swelling, and infections, and sometimes even delays in growth and puberty.
Wow.
Oh, and jaundice, where the skin and eyes turn yellow.
So many different things it can affect.
Yeah, it's a tough condition.
And I know it's more common in certain groups of people, right?
Yeah, definitely. We see it more often in people whose ancestors are from Africa, including African Americans, also in Hispanic Americans, especially from Central and South America,
Okay.
and people from the Middle East, Asia, India, and the Mediterranean, too.
So it's pretty widespread geographically.
Yeah, it is. In the U.S. alone, it's estimated that about 100,000 people have SCD,
Oh.
and about 1 in every 365 Black or African American babies is born with it.
That's a lot of people.
It is. So let's talk about how it was discovered. It wasn't always something doctors knew about, right?
Right, of course. It must have been quite a journey to figure it out.
Yeah. The first official medical description was in 1910. A doctor named James Herrick, he saw these weird, elongated, and sickle-shaped red blood cells in a blood sample from a dental student.
Interesting. So it was just a visual observation at first?
Yeah, pretty much. Actually, an intern working with Dr. Herrick named Ernest Edward Irons, he had made sketches of these unusual cells back in 1904.
Oh, wow. Even earlier.
Yeah, but it was Herrick's report in 1910 that really got the ball rolling, scientifically.
All right.
The name sickle cell anemia came later, in 1922, from a researcher named Mason.
Okay, so it all started with someone looking through a microscope and seeing something odd.
Exactly.
Yeah,
It's amazing what you can find if you just look closely enough.
So what were some of the big breakthroughs that came after that initial discovery?
There were a few key moments. In 1927, Hahn and Gillespie figured out that the sickling happened when there wasn't enough oxygen.
Okay.
That was big because it showed what triggered the shape change. Then in 1940, Sherman confirmed that the sickling was because of an actual molecular change in the hemoglobin itself.
So it wasn't just the cell, but something inside it causing the problem.
Exactly. And one of the biggest discoveries came in 1949 when Linus Pauling and his team found out that sickle cell anemia was caused by an abnormal type of hemoglobin.
Oh, wow, that's huge.
It was. It made SCD the first molecular disease, meaning it was the first time a disease was directly linked to a specific molecule being wrong.
The first one ever.
Yeah, the very first. That was a massive breakthrough in our understanding of diseases.
That's so cool. So what about figuring out the exact genetic cause?
Well, also in 1949, Neal and Beat figured out that SCD was inherited in an autosomal recessive pattern,
Okay.
which explains why some people carry the trait but don't have the disease. You need 2 copies of the abnormal gene, one from each parent, to actually get sick.
Right, right.
Then in 1957, Ingram found the exact defect, a single amino acid substitution in the hemoglobin molecule.
It's amazing how one tiny change can have such a big impact.
It really is. Later on, in the late 70s, scientists mapped the sickle cell gene to a specific spot on our DNA,
Okay.
and then treatments like hydroxyurea came along, which helped manage some of the complications.
So it's been a constant process of discovery.
Yeah, definitely. Each step built on the one before it.
Now, I remember reading something about a connection between sickle cell and malaria. That seems kind of strange.
It's fascinating, actually. It turns out that having just one copy of the sickle cell gene, having sickle cell trait, actually protects you against malaria.
Really?
Yeah. People with sickle cell trait are less likely to get severe malaria, which is a big problem in many of the same places where SCD is common.
Okay.
It's basically natural selection at work.
Oh, I see.
A gene that can cause a bad disease in one situation can actually help you survive in another.
It's like a trade-off.
Yeah, exactly. So we've talked about what SCD is and how we discovered it.
Right.
Now let's get into the genetics. What's the actual glitch that causes all this?
Right, let's break it down.
So the problem is in the hemoglobin beta gene, or HBB gene, it's on chromosome 11.
Okay.
This gene tells the body how to make beta-globin, which is a part of the hemoglobin molecule.
Right.
The mutation is a point mutation. It's like changing a single letter in a long word.
Okay.
In this case, at the 6th codon of the gene, an adenine, or A, is replaced with a thymine, or T.
Okay.
So the code changes from JAG to GTG.
It's crazy how such a small change can have such huge consequences.
It is, isn't it? So this single letter change in the DNA code actually changes the protein that gets made.
Oh, right, because DNA is the blueprint for proteins.
Exactly. So the normal DNA sequence, JAG-E, tells the cell to put the amino acid glutamic acid into the beta-globin chain
Okay.
at the 6th position.
Right.
But the mutated sequence, GTG, tells the cell to put in a different amino acid, valine, at that same spot.
Interesting. So what's the difference between those two amino acids?
Well, glutamic acid likes water. We call it hydrophilic. But valine doesn't like water. It's hydrophobic.
So that one change makes a big difference in how the protein behaves.
Absolutely. It's like swapping a brick that loves water with one that hates water. The whole structure changes.
Right. And this is why it's called an autosomal recessive condition. Yeah.
Exactly. You need 2 copies of the mutated HBB gene, one from each parent, to have SCD.
Okay.
If you only have one copy, you have sickle cell trait, but usually no symptoms.
And different mutations can lead to those other forms of SCD, like HBSC and HBs beta thalassemia.
Right. Depending on the combination of mutations, the severity and symptoms can vary.
Now, what about fetal hemoglobin? I know babies have a different type of hemoglobin.
Right. Fetal hemoglobin, or HbF, is the main type of hemoglobin in babies before they're born and for a few months after.
Okay.
It's made of 2 alpha globin chains and 2 gamma globin chains.
Mm-hmm.
Adult hemoglobin, HbA, has 2 alpha-globin and 2 beta-globin chains.
Right, right.
The important thing about HbF is that it doesn't have that beta-globin part with the mutation.
Oh, I see.
So it doesn't polymerize, meaning it doesn't stick together and form those rigid fibers, even when oxygen is low.
So babies with SCD don't show symptoms right away.
Exactly. They're protected by their HbF for the first few months.
Okay.
Then, as HbF levels drop and HbS takes over around 5 to 6 months old, that's when the symptoms start to show up.
That makes sense. So the faulty gene causes the production of this abnormal beta-globin, which then forms hemoglobin S.
Right.
What's the big difference in how HbS acts compared to normal HbA?
Well, when there's plenty of oxygen, HbS actually works pretty much like HbA.
Okay.
It can bind to oxygen and carry it around the body.
Right.
But the problems start when oxygen levels drop.
So like in those tiny capillaries where red blood cells deliver oxygen to the tissues?
Exactly. That's where the trouble begins.
Okay, so low oxygen is the trigger.
Mm.
What happens to the HbS molecules then?
Remember how valine doesn't like water?
Yes.
Well, when HbS releases oxygen, that valine gets exposed. And because it hates water, it tries to stick to other deoxygenated HbS molecules.
Like magnets.
Sort of. It's called polymerization. The HbS molecules stick together and form long, rigid fibers inside the red blood cell.
And those fibers are what force the cell into that sickle shape.
Exactly.
And that's why babies with SCD don't have symptoms right away.
Right. Because their HbF doesn't do this. It only happens with HbS when it's not carrying oxygen.
Okay, so we've got these rigid fibers pushing the cell into a sickle shape. Why is that shape so bad for the body?
Well, think about it. Normal red blood cells are flexible. They can squeeze through tiny blood vessels.
Right.
But sickle cells are stiff and elongated. They get stuck easily.
Oh, I see.
This causes vaso-occlusion, which means blockage of blood vessels. It's also called a sickle cell crisis or a vaso-occlusive episode.
So it's like a traffic jam in the bloodstream.
Exactly. These blockages prevent oxygen and nutrients from reaching the tissues.
And that causes the pain crises.
Exactly. And it can happen anywhere in the body. But it's most common in the chest, abdomen, and joints.
And these blockages can cause long-term damage too, right?
Absolutely. When blood flow is blocked, tissues don't get enough oxygen.
Which is called ischemia.
Right. And if this happens repeatedly, it can damage organs over time.
So it's not just the immediate pain, but the cumulative effect.
Exactly. It's a big problem.
We've talked a lot about blood flow, but what about the actual job of red blood cells, carrying oxygen? Does the sickling mess that up too?
It can. Research shows that the blood of people with SCD often has a lower affinity for oxygen.
So it lets go of oxygen more easily.
Yeah. Interestingly, the HbS molecule itself actually binds oxygen about the same as normal hemoglobin.
Okay.
But in SCD, there are other things going on that make the red blood cells release oxygen more readily.
Like what?
Well, for one, there are higher levels of 2-argon-3-diphosphoglycerate, or DPG.
Okay.
DPG helps red blood cells unload oxygen.
So it's like a helper molecule.
Yeah, you could say that.
But is releasing oxygen more easily actually a good thing in this situation?
Not really. Even though it sounds counterintuitive, in SCD, it actually contributes to a problem called chronic tissue hypoxia.
Which means the tissues aren't getting enough oxygen.
Exactly. And the body tries to compensate by making the heart work harder, but that's not always enough.
So it's like a vicious cycle. The sickle cells block blood flow, which reduces oxygen delivery, and then the low oxygen causes more sickling.
That's a great way to put it. It's a complex and interconnected problem. And because of this, people with SCD can develop a lot of different long-term health issues.
It sounds like it can affect almost every part of the body.
It pretty much can.
What are some of the most serious complications?
Well, there's the chronic anemia, which causes fatigue and weakness,
Right.
and the recurrent pain crises, which can be really debilitating.
Yeah.
But it can also cause strokes when blood flow to the brain is blocked,
Wow.
and acute chest syndrome, which is a serious lung problem.
Okay.
The spleen can get damaged and stop working properly, which increases the risk of infections.
Right.
And then there's damage to other organs like the kidneys, liver, and heart.
This is really serious stuff.
It is. And there are eye problems, sometimes even blindness,
Wow.
and a vascular necrosis, which
Yeah.
is when bone tissue dies because it's not getting enough blood.
Ouch.
It's very painful. And then there are leg ulcers, gallstones, and priapism, which is a painful, prolonged erection in men.
It's amazing how one little genetic change can have so many different effects.
It really is. And in children, it can even delay growth and puberty.
Okay.
And as I mentioned, the spleen damage increases the risk of infections.
Right.
And they're also at higher risk for blood clots, even though it seems like they would be more likely to bleed.
That's counterintuitive.
It is. And pregnancy is riskier for women with SCD, too.
It's a lot to deal with.
It is. But the good news is that there's a lot of research going on to find better treatments and maybe even a cure.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
So to sum it all up, sickle cell disease is a complex genetic disorder caused by a single mutation in the Beta-Globin gene. This leads to the production of abnormal hemoglobin, HbS, which, when oxygen levels are low, polymerizes and forces red blood cells into that sickle shape.
Exactly.
And that shape causes all sorts of problems like blocked blood flow, reduced oxygen delivery, and chronic anemia.
Right.
It's been fascinating to learn about how we discovered SCD from those first observations to the intricate molecular details we know today.
It's a testament to the power of scientific inquiry.
It really is. And while SCD is a serious condition, it's encouraging to know that there's hope for new and better treatments, maybe even a cure someday.
Absolutely. Understanding complex diseases like this helps us appreciate how interconnected our bodies are.
It's amazing how one tiny change can have such widespread effects. It makes you wonder what other hidden variations in our genes might be influencing our health.
It's a fascinating thought.
It really is. Thanks for sharing your expertise with us today.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.